week I've been looking at a paper by Mark Newman of the University of Michigan and his colleagues on social networks. In particular, what they're looking at is the so-called small world phenomenon. Now, this was something that was discovered in the 1960s by the psychologist Stanley Milgram and his co-workers in a famous experiment where they tried to get letters directed to a particular stockbroker who worked in Boston by sending them out to a randomly selected group of people in Nebraska and asking them to send the letter on to someone who they thought might be better placed to get it to the intended target. And they didn't give an address. This was the problem. They simply indicated the man's name and his profession and the fact that he worked in Boston. Now, most of these letters didn't reach the stockbroker at all, but some did. And of those that did, it took an average of just 6 journeys before they got there. So this gave rise to the popular notion of 6 degrees of separation, the idea that we are, on average, connected through our social networks with everyone else on the planet through no more than 6 steps. And this is a finding that has been borne out in more recent work using email networks. Again, asking people to forward an email on to someone who might know the person they're intended for, which again found that it seems to be somewhere in the region of 5 to 7 steps that are needed to get an email to its target, regardless of where it starts off from. Now, what Mark Newman and his colleagues have done in this paper is to ask whether the world has always been this way. Has it always been small, or was there a time when social networks were much bigger, when it would take a lot of steps to connect you to anyone else at random? And they've done this by looking in particular at the 14th century. Now, this, of course, is a time when you can't exactly conduct experiments. You can't send out letters in the 14th century and see how long they take to reach people. And in any case, of course, most people were illiterate at that time. So what the researchers have done instead is to try to get some handle on what the social networks of that time looked like by looking at how diseases were transferred, and specifically at how the Black Death spread throughout Europe in the 14th century. The idea here is that diseases like this spread primarily through direct physical contact between people. Now, it's true that the Black Death and other diseases could be spread by organisms such as rats and fleas, but those organisms themselves didn't tend to move very far unless they were carried by human transportation. So the hope was that in some ways the network on which diseases spread reflects the network of person-to-person contacts, and that in turn was a reflection of what people's social world looked like. And so Newman and colleagues have set out to look at how diseases spread on these different kinds of networks, how they spread in a small world compared to how they would spread in a large world without all these shortcuts between people. They did that by conducting computer simulations of the spread of a disease like the Black Death. And first of all, they looked at how, in historical terms, the Black Death actually travelled through Europe. It began in the Levant and the area around the Black Sea and entered into Europe through the Mediterranean ports. And you can see that it spread very gradually, rather like an ink blot spreading through blotting paper. So what Newman and colleagues did was to carry out computer simulations of the spread of an infectious disease like this to see what the pattern looked like on a small world social network or contact network and on a large world network which lacks any of these shortcuts that connect people in distant places. And this is what they found for those 2 cases. This is the big world and this is the small world. So you see that only in the large world does the disease spread in this very gradual, sort of diffusive way, whereas in a small world you get these sudden jumps that trigger off a new centre for the disease to spread from in a distant place from where it began. Now this may sound quite simple. It was actually a little bit more complicated than this, because what the simulations were really looking at was two different mathematical expressions for how the number of contacts of any particular person decreased the further away you got from them. And here are those two expressions for the two cases. So what the researchers had to do was to show that these two expressions corresponded, in effect, to a large world and a small world. So we can see that in the 14th century, at least, the world was still large. And it raises the question of when the change happened between then and the small world that we have today. Newman and colleagues suspect that it may well have happened in the 19th century. That was, of course, the time when transportation networks began to grow and expand, and also when it became more and more possible to stay in touch socially with people a long distance away from us by using the telegraph and later the telephone. But that's a question that further work is going to have to resolve, probably using the same kind of epidemiological data that have been used here. Here's where you can find the paper and some more information about social networks.